Colonies come of age. Types of colonies you'll need to know. You need to know what a proprietary colony is, royal colony, and a charter colony. Proprietary colonies is a colony granted by a king or a queen to an individual, group, or person who could make laws and rules as they wish. Royal colony is just what it suggests. It's controlled directly by the king or queen, by the crown, and a charter colony is given to a group to rule or person to rule in the king's name. Southern colonies, here they are: Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. There's a better look at them. So Maryland's created by Lord Baltimore. It's a haven for Roman Catholics being persecuted in England. Maryland Toleration Acts passed in 1649. And it's to protect Catholics, the minority, from persecution. Catholics are a minority over here in the New World at the time. It's mainly Protestants. Its precedent here is it sets religious freedom. Southern colonies, the Carolinas, were owned by proprietors. These proprietorships were given to 8 men, mostly subsistence farming, which was growing enough only to survive. This area became major exporters of naval stores, supplies for shipbuilding and repair. South Carolina, hate to say it, but they had better ports. The port of Charleston was a really big port. And as you see, of course, used slave labor on the plantations to create cash crops. Southern colonies continued here with the Georgia colony. James Oglethorpe was a proprietor of Georgia, and he built this as a refuge for debtors in England. Basically, back then, when you went into debt and you could not pay your debts back, you were thrown into prison until you worked off your debt. So this was a refuge for debtors. He barred alcohol and slavery in Georgia. So slavery was not practiced under James Oglethorpe. So southern colonies, about half the population lived in the south. Of course, the warm climate, fertile soil spurred the plantation system. Plantation system is basically farming for cash crops. In Virginia, North Carolina, tobacco. In South Carolina and Georgia is rice. North Carolina had rice as well. If you've heard of Orton Plantation, that was a rice plantation. And if you've been into Smith Creek from the river and you've noticed the seaweeds in their very narrow rows, looks like you can almost put a boat in between them, that's because that used to be a rice plantation as well in that area. So South Carolina also grew indigo. Most lived on small farms, however. Wealth came from the big plantations. So the New England colonies: Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Connecticut, Rhode Island. There you go. Plymouth colony, as you see, first successful colony in New England. Remember, 1620. They were searching for religious freedom. Some wanted a pure type of church. Others wanted to separate from the Church of England completely. Pilgrims were separatists. They were led by William Bradford. He wrote an account of Pilgrim life entitled Of Plymouth Plantation. So, as we said, they come over seeking religious freedom. About 100 sailed on the Mayflower. The Mayflower Compact was written on board the Mayflower. It's the first form of direct democracy seen in the New World by Europeans. And you still see it today in New England town meetings. And this sets the precedent for self-rule. Remember, direct democracy is where everybody votes on every issue directly. So all townspeople got together and voted on every issue directly. So the New England colonies, the first winter, over half the people died. The next spring, the Native Americans taught them how to farm. And in that fall, October of that year, they had their Thanksgiving, 1621. It's the only time they celebrated a Thanksgiving. We don't celebrate Thanksgiving over here formally until 1864. President Lincoln passes that law. Massachusetts Bay Colony, Puritans settled this area. John Winthrop, he's a lawyer in England, and he's the leader of this colony. He's the one that proclaimed we're gonna create a city upon a hill. You'll often hear presidents use this term. We want to be a city on a hill, and what this means is basically we want to do things so right that other places in the world look up to us. So they believe they could create the most pure society and serve God, one for all to admire. However, they did practice no tolerance. It was either their way or the highway when it came to religion, and you were not allowed to question the church. Dissenters were often banished, like Anne Hutchinson, before her, Roger Williams, and Thomas Hooker. This area had the Salem witch trials. Eventually, Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth eventually combined to form one colony, the Massachusetts colony. So, religious dissent's common. Number of reformers split from the Puritan Church and found colonies where religious freedom was acceptable. And Roger Williams does this when he founds Rhode Island. And Anne Hutchinson follows 3 years later. He founds Rhode Island in 1636. Anne Hutchinson will move to Rhode Island in 1639 because she's banished, because she believed everyone could communicate directly with God, and you didn't need the church to be the intermediary. The Salem witch trials happened in 1692, and what happened? Several girls accused 3 people of being witches. Really, you know the story. It's a West African lady who teaches a few girls West African dances, and people go crazy. The gap between rich and poor really shown in this. Quarrelsome neighbors, mainly women, will be accused of being witches. In all, 20 men and women are executed for being witches and warlocks, and even one dog. They actually executed a dog. So the mass hysteria and intolerance prevail. Think of some of today's witch hunts that you see. So Roger Williams, he founded Rhode Island after being banished from Massachusetts Bay Colony. He contradicted the Puritans in 2 areas. He said we should pay the Indians for land because Europeans came over and they're settling their land, Native American land. And he suggested a separation of church and state. He said that the church shouldn't be running political affairs. He said it's dangerous to mix the two. So this sets precedent. Thomas Hooker, he's also banished from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and he goes on to form Connecticut. And he writes the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut as the first written constitution written by a European in America. The New England colonies, as you see, the type of economy in New England, agriculture is discouraged because of rocky, hilly soil. Small, self-sufficient farms and towns are set up. Long-distance trade is going to be what this area is going to be dependent on. Largest city was Boston. And fishing and shipbuilding were more important than farming. They were also part of the triangular trade. Here's a map of the triangular trade. There's another map. And here's what triangular trade is. This is an oversimplification, by the way. It's really trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. Raw materials are shipped to Europe. That would be tobacco, rum, and sugar. That's some of the stuff. Stage 2, these manufactured goods were shipped to Africa. That would be guns, cloth, and a lot of rum. And stage 3, slaves are shipped to the Americas to make raw materials. And the Americas, mainly the Caribbean. So Europeans began to use slave labor in their colonies to grow crops, mine, etc. Native Americans were used for a while, but Native Americans knew the land better than the colonists did, and so they would either get worked to death or they'd run away. And a lot of them started running away, so they had to bring somebody in to fill the labor shortages. And Africans didn't know the land as well as colonists. So Africans began to be brought over to the Americas. The slave trade then became the main focus for Europe's relations with Africa. So the Middle Passage, and if you want to see a little more, there's a little video here on the Atlantic slave trade for you. But the Middle Passage is the name given to the part of the triangular trade that went between Africa and the Americas, carrying the Africans. Keep in mind, these ships were merchant ships just converted over into slave holding ships, slavers. All right, they had the equipment on the boats and they could convert them over, and once they got the goods off the ship, they would load the slaves on. Slaves were captured by other Africans for the most part, pretty much all early days, and sold to Europeans and Americans in exchange for weapons. If you want to know where most slaves come, here's the or most slaves were sold. Here's the top. Here's 3 places. The Caribbean got 67% of all slaves. Brazil was the leading South American countries with 13%, and North America got 4%. So what's going on in the Caribbean where we need all these slaves? Sugar plantations. The Middle Colonies, that would be New York, Delaware, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. There's a better look at it. So Pennsylvania colony established by William Penn in 1681. Penn wanted to establish a society that practiced religious toleration. Many members of the colonies were Quakers, and this was a Protestant group that believed in nonviolence. They felt that all people should be treated as equals, and they treated natives fairly. They treated Native Americans fairly. Had good relations with them. The Middle Colonies, the breadbasket. It's known as the breadbasket because the farms would produce vegetables and grains and cash crops. So you see a mixture of farming and commerce here. They did a little bit of the North. They did a little bit of what the North did, and they did a little bit of what the South did. And they had the soil to do it, and they had the ports to do it. So you have small manufacturing of glass, textiles. New York City and Philadelphia were the 2 largest cities in North America. Colonial life, pretty much social classes. You have upper, middle, and lower. There's your largest cities. And urban problems definitely fire, clean water, waste, and poverty. Women had few legal rights, did many of the jobs on the farm. Only single women could own property or run a business. Religion also helped make sure women would continue to be subservient to men. You need to know this. This is important. The Great Awakening started in 1691, roughly 1691, with Jonathan Edwards. By the 1740s, it had reached its height, and they were preaching the dangers, warning of the dangers of hell, warning of what could happen to you. They set up the revival system. You need to know that. It began in the colonies. New churches and new denominations spring up, so you start to see more religious diversity. Religious toleration became essential, and by the late 1700s, open religious persecution was rare. So people were starting to tolerate different religions, and this, like I said, from 1649, the Maryland Toleration Act, right on through here. It leads us to where we are today, where we practice freedom of any religion. So it taught colonists if their religion didn't live up to their expectations, they could just break with their religion and they could switch their religion. And these are very religious people. So the political consequence would be if your government's not living up to what you think it should, you can leave it. A la the break with England. That's the Great Awakening is a huge concept you need to grasp, because it's one of the underlying factors of why we break with England. Freedom of the press. John Peter Zenger in 1734, he criticized the English governor, and basically the winter 1734-1735. He has to fight a court case. The papers were burned, or the governor seized his papers were burned. The court ruled freedom of speech was the right of every British citizen. It's a landmark law case because it establishes freedom of the press, one of your First Amendments. Education. More citizens were educated in New England colonies. Public schooling was made available, and as you see here, Religion was the primary force behind higher education.